Hello Orchid friends, how are you? Welcome back to my channel. If this is your first time watching my video, my channel is all about orchids. From what orchids I have, how I grow them, my thoughts on certain orchid topics, to what orchids in my collection are blooming, etc. So if you want to follow along my orchid hobby adventure, please consider subscribing to my channel and turn on the notification. Today in this video, we're going to look at one of my Laelia cattleya orchids, and it's the tropical pointer Cheetah. Many of you may know that I don't have a whole lot of cattleya type orchid in my collection, but this is one of the few ones that are old enough to bloom. So let's take a look at this orchid and share with you how I take good care of this orchid so that it blooms for me year after year. I think cattleya orchid type is a type of orchid that's very interesting and fascinating. However, because of my growth space and my preference, I tend to like orchids in small sizes. So for regular cattleyas that could be really tall, they are, it's impossible. I just wouldn't want them. And for this one, it's a mid-size cattleya orchid. So that's why I got it. And how I keep this orchid where it is on my growing rack, it used to be on the second or even the third level. It's not on the highest, but during this last bloom cycle, I moved it up to the very top shelf and to the brightest corner of the shelf. And I think that may have contributed to the fact that this time it's giving me better blooms. But also another possibility is that I did increase the frequency of my fertilizing routine. With this one, I usually give it 50% concentration of the recommended dosage. So for my Phalaenopsis orchid, it's just quarter strength, but this is a half strength fertilizer, and I give this orchid fertilizer pretty much every week. Actually, pretty much every time I water this orchid, I should say that, because I keep this orchid on a really dry side. So if you look at the leaves, which you'll see later in the video, you're going to see that some of the leaves are actually on the drier side. You can kind of see a little bit of wrinkle here and there, but it still manages to bloom. I think that it would probably have better bloom count if I keep up with the watering. And the reason I say keep up with the watering is because this orchid is still potted in bark chips. I only added bark chips into the container, but I have not repotted, and it's still in bark chips. And in my environment, which is on the drier side, it just dries out really quickly, but I don't always remember to water this orchid because it's now on the very top shelf, and if I don't look at it, then I don't remember. So that's kind of how it is. But bark chips is still a very good media to use if your environment has higher humidity. And because in my environment it's already on the drier side, and especially during winter time there is central air on, so it's really dry, so I have to use humidifier to supplement, to help with the humidity. But this orchid, for cattleya orchid in general, their pseudobulbs are water retentive. They have moisture, they have water retained in their pseudobulbs that can allow them to sustain or endure a longer period of dry days. So dryness won't kill them unless we're talking about no water whatsoever for 3, 4, 5 months. But typically just a few days, a couple weeks, it's really not that big of a deal in my experience. I have 7 other cattleya type orchids, but those you haven't seen them in my channel because they're really small. They're really just, I've got them for like around $10, $12, $15, so they're really ceiling size. I don't even know when they're gonna bloom, but they're all really small, and some of them are even potted in a 12-ounce plastic cup, so it's really tiny. But this one is one of the 2s that are actually big enough that I have made videos on. And the other one is another mid-sized orchid, but That one hasn't bloomed either, so I haven't really, done any videos on that one. But this one is a reliable bloomer. Last year it bloomed with a couple flowers, but I remember the flowers being smaller and thinner. This year, this time around, I think the flowers are much more substantial in terms of the color saturation, as well as the thickness, the substance of the flowers, the petals and sepals, as well as the lips. I think this year's lip, the color is much nicer. Last year, I remember it being a little bit more on the pink side, especially the dots, the purple dots that you see. But this year, the color is much darker, and the background of the flower, this yellow flower color in the background. Last year, I remember it being yellow at first, and then it quickly fades into pretty white. But this year, it remains rather saturated, so it's quite interesting. And this one is also fragrant. However, it's not a very strong fragrance. You do have to put your nose close to the flower to be able to smell that. And I remember the first week of its bloom, a week after it bloomed, there was no fragrance. And a week after that, then it started to have some fragrance if I get close to it. Camellia orchids roots are pretty sensitive, so when necessary, you only repot them when necessary. And the best time to repot, there are two factors that goes into whether you should repot or not. One is season. Spring and summertime, when the weather temperature is nicer and warmer, that's when you should repot. The second factor is when the orchid is trying to grow a new growth, shooting out a new growth, but before the roots are growing out, because that way, once it's transported into new container, new media, and when it starts to grow, when the new growth is starting to put out roots, the roots will be able to find its way to anchor itself and grow into the media. Grab the new media and then grow into it. That will be the best time to do the repot, when there's new growth and when the season is right. When these two factors or conditions are not there, and if you do a repot, you can potentially set back the orchid. And when you set back a Camellia orchid, for example, that particular year, you may actually see very little or no growth at all. And I have seen my friends' Camellia orchids being disturbed and set back, and practically the whole year there was just no movement. If not even like a little bit of root growth or a little bit of leaf growth, it was just stagnant, completely stalling. So it's important. I mean, it's just a very sensitive type of orchid. The orchid roots, really, when they're growing, right, and if you somehow touch it and crack it, usually that root would just die. They're just so sensitive like that. And also, Camellia type orchid in general, they require higher sunlight, right, and then higher amount of fertilizer. But then they do require the wet-dry cycle to be even more distinctive. So you really don't want to rewater when the media is still somewhat moist. You really want to wait until it's dry. But with my Camellia orchids that are in semi-hydro setup, the roots that have already grown into the media and into the reservoir, it actually doesn't matter. The roots actually love it. So I think it's really just a matter of training your orchids so that it would adopt. And once it's adapted to whatever method you use, especially for semi-hydro, once they have the roots have adapted to semi-hydro and the high moisture, high water condition in the reservoir, it doesn't really, it doesn't rot the roots. I mean, the roots are really healthy for some of the Camellias that I have, so it really just depends. But you do have to look at your Camellia orchids case by case, because some Camellias may not do well in semi-hydro, just like some Phalaenopsis orchids that I have. Some are really good with semi-hydro, but some are struggling, right? And if there is that problem, you simply adjust, because they're all individuals, just like human beings, and not one size fits all. My overall assessment of this orchid this year is I'm pretty happy. I mean, considering the amount of care and time that I spent on this orchid is very minimum, and it still gives me two pretty decent sized flowers with really good color, so I'm happy. This is all I have for you today. If you like this video, please give it a thumbs up. And if you would like to get more orchid related videos from my channel, please subscribe and turn on the notification. I want to wish you happy growing, and I will talk to you in my next video. Ciao!